The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with an official-looking crest that Margaret had never seen before. She stood in her cramped apartment kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, turning the envelope over in her trembling hands. The return address read, Whitmore and Associates, Estate Attorneys. Margaret was a nurse, a widow for 7 years, and a single mother to her 2 teenage children. She worked double shifts at St. Catherine's Hospital to make ends meet, and every penny counted. The idea that someone would leave her anything was absurd. She didn't have wealthy relatives. In fact, most of her family had cut ties with her years ago when she'd married David against their wishes. Even now, 3 years after losing him to a sudden aneurysm, they hadn't reached out. She opened the letter with shaking fingers and began to read. The words seemed to swim before her eyes. According to the document, her distant great-uncle Harold, a man she'd met only once at her wedding when she was barely 18, had passed away at the age of 93. He had no children, he had no close family except Margaret apparently, and he'd left his entire estate to her. The mansion was called Ashford House, located in western Pennsylvania, about 3 hours from where she lived. Margaret read the description twice, certain she must be misunderstanding something. 32 rooms, 15 acres, built in 1887, listed on the historical register. And it was hers. "Mom, are you okay?" Her daughter, Sophie, 16 and perceptive in the way all teenagers seem to be, had entered the kitchen and noticed Margaret's pale complexion. Margaret showed her the letter wordlessly. Sophie read it, then looked up with wide eyes. This has to be a scam. But it wasn't. The following week, Margaret took time off work, unpaid time, because she couldn't afford to lose the income, but she also couldn't miss this, and drove out to see the property. Her son Marcus, 18 and already attending community college, had insisted on coming with her. Sophie stayed behind with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen. The drive felt long and surreal. As they wound through increasingly rural roads, Margaret's heart began to pound. What if the house was falling apart? What if there were debts attached to it? What if inheriting it meant she'd somehow have to sell it to pay taxes? She had so many questions, and none of them had good answers. Then they turned onto a tree-lined drive, and Margaret forgot to breathe. Ashford House emerged from the autumn foliage like something out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. It was enormous, a Victorian masterpiece of red brick and limestone, with turrets and bay windows and wraparound porches. Ivy crawled up the eastern wall. The gardens had gone wild, overgrown but beautiful, in that untended way that nature had of being both lovely and slightly tragic. "Wow," Marcus said, and he said it with genuine awe. The attorney, Mr. Whitmore, was waiting for them on the front steps. He was an older gentleman with steel-grey hair and an air of practiced professionalism. He shook Margaret's hand formally and gave her a look that might have been sympathy. "Your great-uncle was a solitary man," Mr. Whitmore said as he led them inside. "He hadn't let anyone into this house in nearly 40 years. The interior was dim, smelling of dust and age, and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. Sheets covered the furniture like ghosts. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from the walls. But underneath the neglect, Margaret could see the bones of elegance. Original hardwood floors, crown molding, a chandelier the size of a car hanging in the entrance hall. Mr. Whitmore led them through a basic tour, explaining that the property would take significant work to restore. The roof needed repairs. The electrical system was outdated. The plumbing would likely need replacing. But structurally, the house was sound. It had survived more than a century and a half with reasonable grace. "There's one more room I should show you," Mr. Whitmore said, leading them toward the back of the house. "Though I confess, I've never personally opened it. Your uncle was very clear in his instructions that only his heir should have access to the master study." They descended into the basement, their footsteps echoing. Marcus wrinkled his nose at the smell, damp stone and coal dust from the old furnace system. The basement was cavernous and cluttered with decades of accumulated items, old furniture, trunks, gardening equipment, things that had simply been cast aside and forgotten. At the far end, behind a rotting velvet curtain, was a small room. Inside was a mahogany desk, several filing cabinets, and on the wall beside a portrait of a young Harold Ashford, what appeared to be a panel of solid wood. "Your uncle left the keys," Mr. Whitmore said, handing Margaret a leather pouch. It contained several old brass keys and a folded piece of paper with her uncle's spidery handwriting. "For Margaret, this is yours now. Use it wisely." "What is this?" Margaret asked, pointing at the wooden panel. "I don't know," Mr. Whitmore admitted. "Your uncle was very secretive. That panel has been locked for as long as I've known him, and I've been managing his estate for 23 years. Margaret and Marcus exchanged a glance. She tried several keys on the filing cabinets first. They opened to reveal folders filled with documents, mostly legal papers and financial records. But the wooden panel resisted the largest key at first. It wasn't until she applied some penetrating oil that she managed to find a keyhole hidden by decades of dust and paint. The key turned. The panel swung open. Behind it was a brass elevator door, impossibly anachronistic in this old basement, so out of place that it seemed like a hallucination. "That's not supposed to be there," Mr. Whitmore said faintly. Margaret and Marcus stared at each other. Neither of them had any idea what to do. Margaret had inherited a mansion with a hidden elevator, and she had absolutely no context for what any of it meant. She pressed the call button. The elevator was surprisingly modern, which made no sense for a basement that seemed untouched since the 1950s. Its brass doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a small cab with wood-paneled walls and a single button, B2. "Your uncle never mentioned a sub-level?" Margaret asked Mr. Whitmore, though by now she suspected he was as much in the dark as she was. "Never," the attorney said. I'm not sure what the legal implications of this are. I may need to consult with the Historical Society. Modifications to a registered historical property need to be—" But Margaret had already stepped into the elevator. Marcus followed her, leaving Mr. Whitmore to worry about legal matters. The descent took longer than she expected. There was a soft whirring sound, and Margaret felt the peculiar weightlessness of moving downward. She counted the seconds in her head. 10, 20, 30. They had to be at least 3 stories down. The walls of the shaft were reinforced concrete, and she could hear the hydraulic system working with mechanical precision, clearly maintained and updated regularly, unlike the decaying mansion above. When the doors opened, Margaret gasped. The room revealed was nothing like the dilapidated basement above. It was vast. Margaret's mind tried to estimate the dimensions and failed. The space stretched out before them like a cathedral, at least 60 feet across and perhaps 80 feet deep. The ceiling seemed to stretch upward into darkness, illuminated only by recessed lights that came on automatically as they stepped inside, creating pools of illumination that revealed treasures like a spotlight revealing actors on a stage. The walls were reinforced concrete, painted a soft museum white. The air was cool and dry, climate-controlled to the precise degree that Margaret suspected had been calibrated for art preservation. And everywhere there were paintings. They covered every wall, floor to ceiling, arranged with a curator's careful eye. There were sculptures on pedestals, positioned to be viewed from all angles. Glass cases held what appeared to be ancient artifacts, Grecian urns with figures painted in precise red figure technique, bronze figurines that looked Etruscan or Roman, carved stone pieces that might have been Egyptian, tapestries hung from the walls, medieval pieces, Margaret guessed, depicting hunting scenes and royal processions. There was furniture too, ornate antique chairs and tables inlaid with mother-of-pearl and exotic woods that looked like they belonged in the palaces of European royalty. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, these are real." He was standing in front of a painting, and Margaret moved to join him, her legs moving slowly as if through water. Even she, with her complete lack of art history knowledge, could sense the significance. The brushwork was exquisite, the kind of mastery that came only from a lifetime of practice. The painting depicted a seascape, dramatic and moody, with waves that seemed to move even as she looked at them, with a quality that seemed to reach out and touch something deep in her chest, a place she hadn't known existed until that moment. There was a small placard beneath it. Margaret had to lean close to read it in the soft light. Claude Monet, 1891. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. Her hand reached out instinctively, then stopped inches from the canvas. She was afraid to touch it, as if the oil paint might crumble at her touch, as if she might somehow damage something irreplaceable just by breathing near it. They spent the next 2 hours walking through the room in a daze. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking photos, though Margaret wasn't sure why, as if they needed proof of what they were seeing. There were works that Margaret recognized from art books or museums she'd visited years ago on a school trip. A Rembrandt landscape, dark and golden and profound. What appeared to be a Picasso, one of his abstract compositions from his later years. A bronze sculpture that Marcus swore was an authentic Rodin, The Kiss, or at least a cast of it. They moved past them like pilgrims in a sacred space, barely speaking, barely breathing. In one corner was a small impressionist painting that Margaret found herself returning to repeatedly. It showed a woman in a garden, reading a letter. Her expression was one of private joy, as if she'd just received news that had transformed her world. Margaret found herself staring at it for long minutes, feeling something stir in her chest. In the center of the room was a large mahogany desk with a leather chair positioned like a throne overlooking the entire collection. On the desktop was a journal, leather-bound and clearly well-used, its pages yellowed with age. The leather was cracked in places, the binding reinforced with linen tape that had been applied many times over. Next to it was a letter, addressed to Margaret in her uncle's handwriting, the same careful penmanship she'd seen on the will papers, but here it was shaky, written by hands that had grown old. Margaret picked up the letter with trembling hands and opened it carefully, as if the paper itself might disintegrate. "My dear great-niece, if you're reading this, I am dead, and you have inherited something precious, not just this house, but this collection. I've spent a lifetime acquiring these pieces, and I've never shared them with anyone. The world doesn't even know they exist. When I was young, I made my fortune in steel. I was ruthless and often cruel, and I'm not proud of the man I was. But the money I accumulated allowed me to do one thing I did care about, preserving beauty. Art, when kept in private hands, is supposed to be a secret joy. Museums are prisons where masterworks are displayed for crowds who glance and move on. I wanted to know these pieces, to live with them, to truly see them. But I was wrong. I've come to understand that in my final years, beauty locked away is beauty that suffers. These paintings, these sculptures, these objects that represent the very best of human creativity, they're meant to inspire. They're meant to challenge and comfort and transform the people who encounter them. I've spent the last 30 years of my life making things right. I've made donations, anonymous donations, to museums and families I wronged. I've paid for the restoration of damaged artworks. I've funded archaeological digs to protect cultural sites. But I was always too afraid to let go completely, too afraid to trust anyone else with what I'd collected. The journal on the desk contains a complete catalogue of everything here, with documentation of provenance for each item. Some pieces were acquired through legitimate channels, others less so. I won't ask for your forgiveness for those acquisitions. I can only tell you that I've tried, in whatever way I could, to make amends. Now it's your turn. You have a choice. You can keep the collection private, as I did. You can sell the pieces and use the money. There is more money than you know. Or you can do what I wished I had done from the beginning. You can let the world see them. The total value of the collection is approximately $45 million. In the filing cabinet in my study, you'll find the paperwork for the accounts I've set up. There are bank accounts, securities, and property holdings that belong to you now. The attorney, Mr. Whitmore, can help you navigate the financial aspects. You won't have to worry about money ever again, Margaret. I don't offer this as if it's a small thing. I know what it's like to struggle. I know how that weight can press down on your shoulders until you feel you might break. I want you to be free of that burden. But the art is yours to decide. I've arranged for its future regardless of what you choose. If you want to donate the collection to a museum, the lawyers can help with that too. If you want to keep it here in this vault, which I've designed to preserve the works perfectly for centuries, then at least you'll know it's safe. The climate control system will run automatically. The security system is state-of-the-art, though no one will ever know to look for it. I'm sorry I never got to know you, Margaret. I'm sorry that pride and stubbornness kept us apart. I saw your wedding picture once, you know. Your father sent it to me, though we hadn't spoken in years. You looked so happy. I envied that happiness, though I was too proud to admit it. I hope that wherever you are in life, this inheritance will somehow make things better. Not just the money, though I suspect that will help, but the knowledge that beauty endures, that meaning can be created, that even a solitary old man can leave something of value behind. Your uncle, Harold Ashford. P.S. There is one painting I hope you'll look at closely. In the east corner of the vault, there's a small portrait in an ornate frame. It meant more to me than all the rest of this collection combined. Margaret read the letter twice, then a third time, tears streaming down her face by the end. The words seemed impossible. $45 million. Hidden art. A vault beneath the mansion. A secret life of redemption and regret. She and Marcus made their way to the east corner, following the trail marked by her uncle's words. The painting was small, perhaps 18 inches by 24, and hung in a frame that looked like gilded wood, intricate and beautiful. The woman in the portrait had familiar eyes, dark and intelligent, with a hint of sadness beneath the grace. "Is that—" Marcus didn't finish the question. Margaret stepped closer, her heart pounding. The style was unmistakable even to Margaret. The woman in the portrait was rendered in the elegant manner of 18th-century portraiture, dressed in a pale blue dress, her hair elaborately styled. But it was her expression that captured Margaret, a quality of private devotion, as if she was thinking of something or someone far away. The placard read, Jean-Antoine Watteau, Portrait of a Woman in Blue, 1715. There was another placard, handwritten in what Margaret recognized as her uncle's handwriting. She had your eyes, Margaret. Your grandmother's grandmother. I hope you'll treasure this, and I hope you'll understand that beauty and love are the same thing. For the first time, sitting in that impossible underground room, surrounded by $45 million worth of art, with paintings that represented the entire arc of human creativity, Margaret allowed herself to fall apart. She cried for her uncle, who had been alone with his treasures for so long. She cried for the beauty in the world and for the burden of caring for it. She cried for her father and for the bridges between them that had never been built. She cried for her own life, for the struggles and the losses and the unexpected grace that had brought her to this moment. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders and said nothing. He'd learned, in the 3 years since his father's death, that sometimes silence was the most supportive thing one could offer. The next 6 months were a blur of activity and transformation that sometimes felt like a dream, as if she might wake up and find herself back in her cramped apartment, back to double shifts and financial anxiety. But it was real. The mansion was real. The money was real. Mr. Whitmore, once he recovered from the shock of discovering the vault, proved invaluable. He was the kind of man who knew people, connections built over decades of legal practice. He connected Margaret with specialists in almost every field imaginable: art conservators who had worked for the Louvre, financial advisors who managed the wealth of dynasties, museum directors from around the world, and lawyers who specialized in the complex and often contentious legal and ethical issues surrounding private art collections, including the sensitive matter of provenance and repatriation. The money was real, more than real. The bank accounts, the securities, the property holdings, it all totaled exactly what her uncle's letter had promised, sometimes down to the penny, as if he'd spent his last days preparing for this moment with meticulous care. The financial advisors wanted to talk about investment strategies and trust funds for the children and tax implications and wealth preservation. Margaret mostly wanted to understand how her life had shifted so completely, so fundamentally, in the span of a few weeks. She was still processing the loss of her great-uncle, while simultaneously being lifted out of financial precarity by his generosity. She took a leave of absence from the hospital. For the first time in her life, she didn't immediately need another job. She could afford to take time. She could afford to think about what came next, which was a luxury she'd never known. The big question, the one that kept her awake at night, pacing through the halls of the mansion at 3 in the morning, was what to do with the art collection. The letter had given her options, but it was Mr. Whitmore who helped her see what her uncle had been hinting at. The decision didn't have to be binary. It wasn't either or. She could keep some pieces and share others. She could create something entirely new. She could honor her uncle's journey from secrecy to sharing. It was Sophie, of all people, who gave her the final push in the direction she needed to go. Sophie had always been intuitive, seeing things about the world that others missed. She came to Ashford House on a Saturday in November, 6 months after the inheritance, bringing with her the skepticism of adolescence and the idealism of youth. The mansion had begun to transform during those months. Margaret had hired contractors carefully and deliberately to address the most urgent structural issues: the roof that was leaking into the eastern wing, the electrical system that was a fire hazard, the plumbing that had corroded with age. But she hadn't wanted to rush the larger restoration. This place deserved to be handled with care and reverence, not cash and carelessness. They were standing in what had been the library, a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that stretched upward into shadows. Most of the books were still there, volumes on art history and literature mixed with practical manuals on estate management and ledgers from 2 centuries of Ashford family business. Some of the books had water damage. Others were so old that the spines crumbled if you held them too firmly. But they were being carefully preserved now. "You should open it," Sophie said, gesturing around the room, "to the public, like a museum." "A museum?" Margaret repeated, surprised at the suggestion. "Sophie, I don't know anything about running a museum. I'm a nurse. I know how to take care of patients and manage a hospital floor. I don't know anything about art or preservation or—" "Then learn," her daughter said with the invincible confidence of the young. "You were a nurse. Nobody is born knowing how to be a nurse. You learned that. You figured out how to take care of us when Dad died. You didn't know how to do that either, but you did it anyway. You can figure this out too. You can figure out anything." Sophie stood with her arms crossed, looking at her mother with an expression of complete certainty. She was beautiful in that moment, not in the way of the portraits in the vault, but in a deeper way. She had the beauty of conviction, of someone who believed in her mother's capacity to do good in the world. And just like that, something shifted inside Margaret. A weight she hadn't known she was carrying seemed to lighten. She could do this. She could take her uncle's collection, this legacy he'd spent his lifetime gathering in secret, carrying alone, and make it into something living, something that could inspire and educate and move people the way great art was meant to do. She could transform Ashford House from a monument to secrecy into a beacon of beauty and knowledge. She pulled Sophie into a tight embrace, and her daughter, for once, didn't immediately pull away. Over the following weeks, Margaret contacted a museum director she'd met during the earlier consultations, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who specialized in Victorian estates and private art collections. Patricia was sharp, visionary, and immediately intrigued by what Margaret was proposing. They met for coffee and then for dinner, and over those conversations, something remarkable began to take shape. Together, they began to develop a comprehensive plan. Ashford House, they decided, would become something unique, a private museum and research centre that was also genuinely accessible. It would be open to the public, but limited by appointment only for small groups, or on special guided tours that could be booked weeks in advance. This would preserve the intimate quality of the space, the sense of wonder that came from discovering these treasures in the context of a home, while simultaneously allowing scholars, students, and art lovers from around the world to access the collection. The estate would also become an artist's retreat, offering month-long residencies to painters and sculptors and writers, creating a legacy not just of preservation, but of inspiration. The financial details were handled with the help of Margaret's newly assembled team of advisors. A non-profit foundation was established to manage the property and fund the ongoing conservation work. Some pieces would be loaned to major museums for special exhibitions, a way of sharing the collection without losing it entirely, without surrendering the core mission of keeping the best pieces at Ashford House. Other pieces would remain in the vault, available for research and study by qualified scholars, but protected from the wear of constant display and the risk of theft. A portion of the $45 million was set aside for the permanent endowment of the foundation, ensuring that even if tourism income declined or circumstances changed, the mission of Ashford House would continue. By spring of the following year, after months of preparation and planning, Ashford House was ready to open its doors. The first official tour was for a group of art history students from a nearby university. 30 young people, ranging from undergraduates to graduate students, filed through the mansion with their professor, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Rodriguez, who had written extensively about Impressionism. Margaret stood in the entrance hall, watching them move through the space with eyes wide with wonder. Eyes that reminded her of her own eyes when she'd first descended into the vault and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace, deep, bone-deep peace. This was right. This felt true to something fundamental inside her. The students lingered longest in front of the Monet, the seascape that had first captivated Margaret all those months ago. Dr. Rodriguez talked about Monet's later years, about the way he'd grappled with loss and aging, about how the late paintings were in some ways more radical and more vulnerable than his earlier work. Several of the students had tears in their eyes when she finished speaking. This was what her uncle hadn't understood, Margaret realized. This was what he'd missed by keeping his treasures locked away. Art wasn't meant to be possessed or hoarded. It was meant to be encountered, experienced, allowed to change whoever came before it. Marcus was there too, working in the background, making sure everything ran smoothly. He'd changed his major to art history after seeing the collection, inspired by the weight and beauty of it, transformed by touching something that transcended the everyday concerns of his life. He was helping to develop the educational programs for Ashford House, working part-time while he continued his studies, and he was thriving in a way he hadn't since before his father's death. Sophie was in the second group of visitors, coming with her art class from her high school. She wandered through the rooms with the casual confidence of someone who knew she could change her mind about anything, who hadn't yet learned to doubt her own instincts, which Margaret envied even as she loved it about her daughter. Sophie had decided to apply to art schools for college, and she spent hours in the library at Ashford House, sketching, filling notebooks with drawings that were raw and honest and full of hope. By the end of that first year, Ashford House had hosted over 3,000 visitors. Articles were written about the collection in prestigious art journals and in magazines that ordinary people read while waiting at the dentist's office. Scholars requested access to the archives to study the pieces and their provenance, to write dissertations and papers that would add to the world's knowledge of these works. A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in making a film about how the collection had been preserved and rediscovered. A famous art critic came to visit and wrote a review that was syndicated in major newspapers, describing Ashford House as a revelation, proof that private collections can serve the public good without losing their soul. It was during the second year of operation that Margaret received an unexpected visit that would change everything in subtle but profound ways. The woman arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn, when the leaves outside were turning gold and crimson. She was in her 70s, dressed in elegant but understated clothes, well-tailored dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse that spoke of refined taste. She came during a research session when Margaret was in her office reviewing applications for the artist residency program. Mr. Whitmore called to say she had a visitor, a woman named Catherine Walsh, who asked to speak privately with Margaret. "My name is Catherine Walsh," the woman said, settling into a chair in Margaret's small office off the main gallery, her movements graceful despite her age. "I believe you have a painting that belonged to my grandmother. Portrait of a Woman in Blue, by Watteau. The one that's displayed in the main gallery?" Margaret's heart skipped. This was the painting with her eyes, the painting her uncle had written about, the painting that had made her cry in the vault. "My grandmother's name was Elise Dubois," Catherine continued, her voice soft but clear. "She lived in Paris before the war. She was a woman of considerable cultivation, a patron of the arts, a collector of beautiful things. She owned that painting, the Watteau. During the war, she fled France with her family, coming to America to escape the German occupation. When she left, she believed many of her treasures had been destroyed or lost. The painting was one of them. She spent the rest of her life wondering what happened to it. She left journals where she wrote about it, mourning its loss." Catherine paused, gathering her thoughts. "My mother, Elise's daughter, she always wondered if perhaps the painting had survived somehow. When I read about your collection, when I saw the photograph of the Watteau in the article, I recognized it immediately. It matched the description in my grandmother's letters exactly. There's even a small detail, a crack in the frame that's been repaired, that my grandmother mentioned specifically." "Your grandmother," Margaret said carefully, her mind racing. "Was she related to Harold Ashford?" Catherine smiled, and in that smile Margaret saw understanding and compassion. "He never married, but he was very close to my great-aunt Marguerite. They had a love affair, very scandalous by the standards of the time, very dangerous during the years before the war. Marguerite was married to someone else, someone my family considered respectable but unpleasant, and they had a complicated and unhappy marriage. But she and Harold were devoted to each other. They could never be openly together. The world wasn't ready for such things, and both of them came from families where duty and appearance mattered terribly. But they corresponded for decades. Their letters are extraordinary. They wrote to each other with such tenderness, such honesty about their feelings." Catherine pulled a photograph from her bag and showed it to Margaret. It was a young woman from the 1930s, dressed in the fashion of that era, with dark eyes and an expression of private joy. She looked extraordinarily like the woman in the Watteau portrait. "After Marguerite died," Catherine said, "in 1954, Harold began acquiring pieces that had belonged to her family or that she had particularly loved. It was his way of keeping her memory alive, I think. He held onto them in secret, never able to share them because of his grief, because of the shame he felt about their relationship, which was ridiculous, of course. But that was how such things were understood in those days." The Watteau was one of these pieces. I think he loved it because it reminded him of her, because the woman in the portrait had that same quality of private joy, that same inward focus that Marguerite had. Margaret felt tears beginning to form. She thought of her uncle, alone in his vault with these treasures, carrying the weight of his grief and his secret love, never able to share it with anyone. "The painting," Catherine said, "has been my family's white whale, our great mystery. Knowing it survived, knowing it's been preserved and cared for, knowing that it's now being appreciated and studied, that would have meant the world to my grandmother, to my mother. And to me, it means that something beautiful came out of a complicated, painful time. It means that my great-aunt Marguerite's memory is being honored, even if the world doesn't know the full story." "Would you consider," Catherine asked, "allowing my family to donate it to the museum, in Marguerite's name and in memory of my grandmother Elise? We would like to be part of this place, part of preserving her legacy." Margaret didn't even need to think about it. The answer came from the deepest part of her heart. "Of course, I would be honored." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the desk to take Margaret's hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for understanding what this means." The donation became official that summer in a small private ceremony. The painting was given a place of honor in the main gallery with a plaque explaining its history. Not the full history, Margaret decided, because some stories were too private to share, but enough to honor the people it had mattered to. The plaque read, "In memory of Marguerite Ashford and Elise Dubois, women of cultivation and courage." This painting represents the enduring power of beauty to connect us across time and circumstance. Catherine became a regular visitor to Ashford House, often bringing her grown children and her grandchildren to see the collection. The children loved the mansion, loved running through the halls and finding secrets in the various rooms, loved the sense of discovery and wonder that permeated the place. She and Margaret became friends, the kind of friends who understood each other without needing to explain everything, who recognized in each other a shared appreciation for beauty and meaning and the importance of memory. A year later, Margaret made the decision to step back from her nursing career entirely, though she did volunteer work at the hospital once a month, enough to keep her connected to that part of her life, to remember where she'd come from and who she'd been before the inheritance. The work was grounding. It reminded her that the mansion and the collection, while miraculous, were part of a larger world of ordinary human struggle and resilience. Ashford House occupied most of her time and energy now. She'd hired a small but dedicated staff, a curator, 2 conservators, an administrator, and 3 docents. She'd taken courses in art history and museum curation, attending lectures and seminars at major institutions, reading voraciously, teaching herself the vocabulary and practice of her new calling. By the end of the 3rd year, Ashford House had become something she'd never quite anticipated when she first descended into that impossible vault. It had become a pilgrimage site for people who cared about beauty and meaning. It had become a place of transformation, where people came and encountered something that changed how they understood themselves and their place in the world. One evening in the summer of her 4th year managing the house, Margaret found herself in the vault once more. She'd been down here perhaps 200 times since inheriting it, but it never quite lost its sense of wonder. The climate control hummed softly. The lights came on automatically as she entered, as they had thousands of times before. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She stood before Claude Monet's Seascape, the painting that had first captivated her all those months ago in that moment of revelation. The dramatic sea seemed to move even as she watched it, waves forever in motion, forever reaching toward a shore that would never quite arrive. It was, she thought, not so different from life itself, the perpetual motion towards something that remained always just out of reach, the beauty in the journey itself rather than in any final destination. She pulled out the journal her uncle had left behind and opened it to a blank page. The pages before hers were filled with his notes in increasingly shaky handwriting, his thoughts on each piece, the stories of their acquisition, his reflections on ownership and responsibility and beauty. She added her own reflections now, documenting the opening of the house, the visitors who had been moved by the collection, the discoveries that had been made through research, the ways in which the paintings and sculptures seemed to grow more meaningful with each viewing. She wrote about Sophie choosing art school. She wrote about Marcus publishing his first scholarly article about Impressionism. She wrote about Catherine and her family, and about how the discovery of Marguerite's connection to the Watteau had transformed her understanding of the collection itself. She wrote about the visitors who'd come, the elderly woman who'd wept in front of the Rembrandt because it reminded her of her late husband, the young man from a poor neighborhood in Pittsburgh who'd come on a school trip and decided that night to pursue a career in art conservation, the academic researchers who'd used the collection to overturn previous attributions and add to the scholarly record, the artists who'd spent months in residence creating work inspired by living alongside masterpieces. She wrote about the challenges too, the constant need for funding, the difficult conversations about provenance and repatriation, the responsibility of stewardship, the weight of knowing that decisions she made today would affect how these works were understood and appreciated for centuries to come. It was close to midnight when she finished writing. Margaret closed the journal gently and returned it to its place on the desk. She stood for a long moment, looking around the vault, at the treasures her uncle had gathered in secret, now no longer locked away, but rather held in trust for the world. She thought about how life worked in circles and spirals. Her uncle had accumulated these pieces alone, driven by a love that he couldn't openly express and a guilt about his own moral compromises. He'd held them in secret, and that secrecy had been both protection and prison. Then Margaret had inherited them, and for a brief moment she too had been tempted by the idea of possession, of having something precious that no one else could have. But Sophie had seen more clearly. Sophie had understood that beauty multiplied when shared, that the act of sharing didn't diminish it, but rather magnified it infinitely. Margaret climbed back into the elevator and ascended through the layers of the earth toward the mansion above. The doors opened into the basement, and she switched off the lights. The wooden panel closed softly, the hidden doorway disappearing once more into anonymity. She climbed the stairs toward the main floor of the mansion, toward the rooms filled with moonlight and the lingering presences of all the people who'd walked through them. She thought about her uncle finding solace down in that vault, creating a private world of beauty. She thought about herself, gradually learning to share that world. And she thought about the future, about what visitors might discover here 100 years from now, what meanings they might make from these objects, what transformations might occur because of the beauty they contained. The mansion was quiet at this hour, wrapped in the peace of late evening. Margaret stood in the entrance hall, looking up at the chandelier that hung like a constellation, and smiled. This was hers now. Not just the building and the art and the money, but the responsibility of memory, the privilege of stewardship, the joy of facilitating transformation through beauty. She thought of her great-uncle Harold, and she spoke to him silently in the darkness. Thank you for the art, for the money, for the trust. I'm taking good care of it, and I'm sharing it, just as you eventually wished you had. I hope wherever you are you understand that I've made the choice you were too afraid to make in life. The next morning, Margaret woke to find a line of people waiting at the gate of Ashford House, a school group that had driven 3 hours to see the collection. She walked to the gate with her docent, and together they welcomed them inside. She watched as the young people, children really, some of them couldn't have been more than 10, entered the mansion with wonder on their faces, unprepared for the beauty they were about to encounter. One small girl, maybe 8 years old, gasped when she saw the entrance hall. "It's like a castle," she whispered to her teacher. "It is a castle," the teacher agreed. "Not with knights and princes, but with treasure nonetheless, treasures of the spirit." As Margaret watched them file deeper into the house, she felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was the inheritance that truly mattered, not the money, though she was grateful for it, but the opportunity to pass forward something beautiful. The opportunity to say to people, "Look at what humans can create. Look at what's possible when we devote ourselves to beauty. Look at what endures." By the end of that 5th year, Ashford House had become a fixture in the cultural landscape of the region. Universities assigned papers about it. Artists competed fiercely for the residency program. The waiting list for tours extended nearly a year in advance. National Geographic featured it in an article about private museums. A prestigious journal published a long scholarly essay about how the opening of the collection had changed the understanding of several Impressionist works. Margaret had been invited to speak at museums and universities. She'd written articles about the experience of inheriting the collection and deciding what to do with it. She'd become, almost without meaning to, something of an authority on questions of cultural stewardship and the ethics of private collections. But the role that meant the most to her was simply being present. She spent hours in the gallery, watching people encounter the art. She paid attention to which paintings drew people back repeatedly, which sculptures caused people to linger. She listened to conversations between visitors, between lovers, looking at the paintings together, between grandparents and grandchildren, between strangers who struck up conversations because they were moved by the same work of art. One afternoon, 2 years into her tenure as the director of Ashford House, Margaret was standing in the library when a young woman approached her. The woman was perhaps 25, dressed simply but with obvious care, carrying a portfolio under her arm. "Ms. Hartley?" the woman asked. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm a senior at Carnegie Mellon studying art conservation. I came to Ashford House 5 years ago on a school field trip when I was in 7th grade. I was miserable then. My parents had just divorced. I was struggling in school. I didn't think my life would amount to anything. But I came here that day, and I saw the Monet, and I saw the Watteau, and something shifted inside me." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I decided that day that I wanted to preserve beautiful things, that I wanted to spend my life taking care of treasures like these. I've been working toward that for 5 years. I'm graduating this spring, and I've been offered a position with the conservation team at the Metropolitan Museum. I came back here to thank you, to thank the person who made it possible for me to discover what I wanted my life to mean." Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears. She reached out and took the young woman's hands. "Thank you for telling me this. Thank you for letting me know that what we do here matters. That's the most important thing you could possibly say to me." After the woman left, Margaret sat alone in the library for a long time. She pulled out her phone and opened the photos she'd taken of her uncle's letter. She read it again, the words she'd memorized by now. "I hope that wherever you are in life, this inheritance will somehow make things better, but the knowledge that beauty endures, that meaning can be created, that even a solitary old man can leave something of value behind." Yes, she thought, the inheritance had made her life better. It had transformed her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. But more than that, it had given her the opportunity to make other people's lives better. It had given her a platform for beauty and meaning-making. It had made her the custodian of something precious, and every day she fulfilled that role with gratitude and humility. The years unfolded. Sophie graduated from art school and became an acclaimed painter, her work influenced by the masters she'd studied at Ashford House. Marcus received his doctorate in art history and became a professor, teaching the next generation of scholars. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Margaret created a small garden in her memory on the Ashford estate, a place of beauty and quiet reflection. Catherine Walsh became like family, visiting regularly, bringing her grandchildren. watching as the collection that had belonged to her great-aunt Marguerite became a beacon of light and meaning for thousands of people. She and Margaret would sit in the conservatory some afternoons and talk about the past, about Harold and Marguerite's impossible love, about the forces of history that kept people apart, about the ways beauty could bridge gaps that seemed unbridgeable. On the 10th anniversary of Margaret's inheritance, Ashford House held a special exhibition. They brought together scholarship from around the world about the collection. They hosted a symposium with art historians and conservators and philosophers discussing questions of beauty, preservation, and public good. They created a documentary about the mansion and its treasures, and they invited everyone who had ever been transformed by the collection to share their stories. That evening, standing in the entrance hall surrounded by people who'd been moved by beauty, Margaret looked up at the chandelier and smiled. She thought of her uncle, finally at peace in whatever realm held the dead. She thought of the young girl who'd gasped at the sight of the mansion. She thought of the thousands of people who'd walked these halls and had their understanding of the world expanded, their hearts opened, their sense of what was possible enlarged. The inheritance had been about more than money or art or property. It had been about responsibility, yes, but also about joy. It had been about the realization that beauty isn't something to be hoarded or possessed, but something to be shared, celebrated, and passed forward. It was a conversation across time, from the artists who created these works, to the collectors who preserved them, to Margaret who now stewarded them, to all the future visitors who would stand before them and feel their hearts opened by the eternal power of human creativity. And that, Margaret thought as she turned to welcome more visitors into the mansion, was the true treasure that Ashford House contained. Not the Monets or the Rembrandts or any single painting, but the shared experience of encountering beauty and knowing in that moment that life was precious and meaningful and full of possibility. The doors of Ashford House remained open, and they would continue to open year after year for as long as the mansion stood. And in those open doors, in that invitation to all who sought beauty and meaning, Harold Ashford's legacy lived on, transformed from a solitary obsession into a shared gift, from a secret locked in darkness into light freely given to the world.